Welcome to week 2 of our 2011 Whiteboard Wednesday series. Got terrific feedback from the discussion we had last week, in particular what we did the notion that I introduced called the realistic imagination of success, which is the Rios model, which is a book called Corpus Rios, written by a fellow by the name of Christopher Tippler, which I highly recommend. One of the concepts which is talked about in that book is this notion of what does winning in fact look like, where you're actually asked to define winning in the context of your business. And when you're talking about a sporting team, well, winning, even that winning means winning, but what in fact are all the things that actually contribute to the outcome of winning. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we actually define that. One of the reasons I talk about it is obviously following the weekend's result, where here we were in a game, in fact playing very good quality football, but really for the second part of the game we're beaten in just about all elements of the game. And in fact, on a number of the key indicators we're actually thrashed, including inside 50s, which is one of our key measurements. So when you ask a group of people in and around a footy team to define winning, particularly when you're going through a development phase where the result of the game won't necessarily be as defining in regard to the outcomes you are actually seeking, whilst clearly the objective, as in winning, is something that we seek to do as each game actually comes and goes. But we also have to know that winning from our point of view means a number of other things. So what I thought I'd do is introduce a couple of things that we do in regard to that, to achieving that outcome. The first one is at the start of each year we do a document where we actually start to look at where in fact our season's expectations are and what we're actually trying to achieve from the season, and that boils down to both a team performance but also the individual player development, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but also this other concept as to how in fact we measure on a week-to-week basis the most important things, and winning being an outcome of a number of things. If we're doing well, we'll generally win the matches. In regard to the actual framework I want to talk about at the moment, or the plan that we want to talk about, is that we must always contextualise it against a very important timeline, if you like. If we started this timeline back in 2008, we saw the 2008 and 2009 years as very much, these years were about building. And building for us was not just a concept of building a football team, whilst clearly that was a focus. It was rebuilding a football club. And rebuilding a football club, which then enabled us to ensure that when our football team was at that phase where it was in the premiership stage, that we could actually resource it to the level that we were. So a lot of that was actually a bit of coming back before we went forward, and we've talked a lot about that bottoming out, but that was a very important period for us. The next phase was probably, and you can never exactly time frame it, but if you said, okay, we're into 2010, 2011, with a view to going into, say, the 2012 year, we see these years here as is what we call being competitive. And I know it's a term which actually gets a little bit almost under the goat of those who actually support our club. When they hear us talk about this notion, you'll hear our players talk about it, you hear our coaches talk about it, but it is just the realistic position that our club's actually in, simply because of where we've in fact come from. Our processes and our way our competition operates and everything in and around it doesn't mean you can fast track these things, particularly when we were coming back from these things. We were 16th on the ladder in both of those years, so we were coming from a long way back, and clearly we saw some improvement into 2010 and we expect that to go into 2012. Underneath all this stuff then is this thing about, obviously is creating a team which is capable of making the finals. But making the finals isn't an objective in itself. Making the finals is an objective as part of this overall need, still very much looking at all of this area from here all the way through to here as very much a development phase in our club. And we can't ever escape that fact. As much as it can frustrate us on a day-to-day basis, and you can even see players with whom we have a high regard for, they can drop away on their performances on not only a game by game, but almost a quarter by quarter basis, and we saw that on the weekend. But the reason we do this is because we recognise that from probably the 2013 year onwards, is that's when, you know, we've got to contend. And how long that window actually stays open will depend on a number of things. But where our view is that this window should stay open for a considerable period of time. And if you can get 4 and 5 and 6 years out of that window, that's the best outcome that we can actually achieve. But our ability to do that will depend on how well we do this. This won't happen by accident. It'll depend on how well we do this. So how do we actually therefore manage and measure performance during this phase where being competitive it can become a really loose word if you're not careful? How do we actually measure performance to know that we're on track? And the most important thing in how we actually measure performance is that our performance is getting measured by a whole lot of other people on a week-by-week basis. You know, it's measured by our supporters who love the club, who ride every moment with it. It's measured by, you know, the hundreds of people whose job in life it is actually to have opinions in and around where the team's at and where it's actually heading. And this has been one of those weeks where clearly that's actually applied. Because if you actually, you know, if you actually said, okay, if this was a sort of like the emotions of a football season that, you know, it can go like that, it can drop like that, and hopefully it'll stay up for real, but it'll go like that. People's emotions can actually work that. But what we need to do, because we understand where the club's at right back here, is that our range probably only sits, our emotional range only sort of sits in and around that area, and that's really important. And if we find ourselves going up and down and responsive and all these sorts of things, it actually, all it does is tell me that we don't know where we're at and we don't know what we're actually doing.